Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for all attending. Well, Chairman's safety announcement, which I will read out just prior to the beginning of the meeting. This announcement is made by the Chairman at the start of any meeting, whether or not observers are in the gallery, which we had none. On hearing the evacuation alarm, 1, leave the building by the nearest marked exit route, which I believe to be there, and there is one there. And to follow the green signs to the assembly point, which is the large staff car park opposite the entrance to the building. Anyone who cannot use the stairs will be helped by officers present after other people have left. Do not return to the building until told it is safe to do so by an authorised officer. The whole of the council site is a no smoking area, and I would ask you that all mobiles be switched to silent. Thank you. Right, I believe it's all but 5 o'clock, so that we don't trip anybody up for who's going to come to the gallery. So the first item is to receive apologies for absence, and I have apologies from Councillor Boutrop. I have no others, and we are all here. Then 2, to receive declarations of interest from members in respect of any matter on the agenda. Is there anything that anybody wishes to declare? There isn't, thank you, so I shall continue. Item 3 is to confirm the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 16th of November 2021. Members are to vote by using their microphone touch screens.
Five in favour and 1 abstention.
Thank you, Tom. So that's carried. Next item is to consider any items that the Chairman agrees to take as urgent business. I have none. So we're now going on to item 5. Peter, are you going to introduce this?
I am, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. The Internal Audit Manager, Juan Fosco, can't be here tonight, I'm afraid. So he's left me, he's given me a note to read to you, which I'll now do. So it's about the Internal Audit Progress Report, item 5. This report is progress on this year's plan up to including the 21st of February. Since the last committee, COVID has continued to present challenges in late quarter 3 of the 21-22 financial year, with staff becoming unavailable at very short notice. This meant that planned audits had to be delayed until after the new year. For this reporting period, there is work at draft report stage in progress or with resources allocated to them with agreed start dates. Since the last committee, management has requested to defer the audit of the COVID-19 grant assurance from quarter 4 until the 22-23 audit plan. Each team member had unexpectedly become unavailable. We've issued our draft reports for the council tax audit, in which we raised a medium priority recommendation. However, the draft report is currently awaiting further management responses. At the time of drafting this report, we have completed fieldwork on the business rates and budgetary controls audits. The draft reports are at the final stages of the review process. Income collection, otherwise known as the cashier's audit, is currently in progress, with aims to complete the fieldwork on the week commencing 28th of February, of course, this week. There was no formal handover of previously raised recommendations from the former auditor at Crawley Borough Council, nor a record listing these, including timescales for implementation. However, we have considered this as part of the 21-22 fieldwork. We will include relevant recommendations raised by the former internal auditor from the 2020-21 internal audit reports. We will continue to monitor recommendations raised as part of the 21-22 internal audits and create a centralised record capturing these, including agreed management actions and timescales for implementation. Updates will be discussed with the Head of Corporate Resources and subsequently provided to this committee in due course, including any outstanding actions, i.e. actions which are past their agreed implementation date. Other matters. A recurring monthly meeting has been agreed to be held with Head of Corporate Resources, with the first session taking place in February 2022. During these meetings, progress against the plan is discussed among any other issues arising from internal audit work or the Council's activities. A 3-year plan was formally put together by the previous internal auditor and approved by the committee. That would be March last year. Following Mazza's appointment in July 2021, and alongside the 21-22 work delivery, there will be a need to revisit its contents for 22-23 and 23-24 to ensure this aligns with the Council's key risks. With several 21-22 reviews to be completed, we suggest proposals around changes to the outline internal audit plan be brought forward in July 2022, at your next meeting, in other words. Our approach in developing the proposed plan for 22-23 is detailed in the paper presented. Thank you. Happy to take questions on Juan's behalf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Councillors, are there any questions? Linda Stockwell, please. Councillor Stockwell.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, this report it spells everything out. I'm very disappointed, I think, that there was no particular handover from Crawley, because it must make their life the new auditors there must make their life very, very difficult. But obviously they were getting on with it. And also, I was rather concerned to note that one of the issues was the fact that members of staff were unavailable at short notice, and which has impeded the audit continuing. Surely there would be more than one person who would be able to answer questions for the auditors. Apart from anything else, there must be some form of succession planning within each department. Perhaps you, Mr. Stewart, would like to comment on that, please.
Peter?
Yes, well, I mean, in terms of staff becoming unavailable at short notice, that has been a bit of a problem for Mazza's, I'm afraid. It does seem as though the whole audit behind, if you like, in real time, what's actually happening on the ground. We relate, as you know, both with external and things. I would say, though, and I'm sure Kevin might come back to this later, that actually when you have to isolate and not visit clients, it does become hard. And when they're available, perhaps the client isn't available because of COVID-19. So there have been some delays, I'm afraid, on that side. And in terms of, if you like, single person working, it's true to say there is still some single person working. The grant claims are not being looked at until 22-23 because a member of staff has had, some time. So, if you like, dealing with the day-to-day work, let's say this person was involved in annual billing of revenues, if they're suddenly not around, someone's got to do that, and so responding best will in the world to the internal audit service it's not going to be their top priority, although it still needs doing. So it has led to unfortunate delays, I'm afraid.
Councillor Hicks.
Thank you, Chairman. I suppose in terms of the internal audit work, and I noticed the reference to SharePoint, I just wondered whether we have ownership of the audit trail in terms of what work has been undertaken and the specifics of what has been checked, because that can often be a useful resource internally and for the external auditor. Is that kept internal to the council's SharePoint, albeit password protected, or is it outside our control?
Thank you. It's internal. So Crawley, although this reads very boldly, Crawley did actually fully provide, fully keep up to date the SharePoint file of all the one's right, and that there was no one document that said here are 10 recommendations, 3 of which are outstanding, but that data actually could have been the reports that have been provided and are in the council's ownership in SharePoint. So the data is all there, but I appreciate it would have taken a while to go through it all.
Councillor Hicks. Councillor Crowley.
Questions on what, following up from Councillor Stockwell. The first one is going back to the point that the audit has been delayed because many staff have become unavailable very quickly. As we are 2 years into the pandemic, and most people have now become very comfortable with virtual meetings, is there no way that if members of staff were self-isolating, that work couldn't have been undertaken virtually? And then my second question is simply, we're told that there was no formal handover. You've explained that documentation is available, but why wasn't there a formal handover?
Yes, it's a very good question. I mean, both parties, both Crawley Borough Council and Mazars, were put in contact some time ago. I suppose, I think the departure of Crawley from the contract, such as it was, the shared service, was certainly not as well planned as it could have been. Some of the resources that Crawley used to use within the contract departed their employment, not for bad reason, but they wanted, we've heard a lot about this in the pandemic, I think, that people are wanting to have a different lifestyle. I think probably they departed their employment at Crawley probably faster than would have been ideal for a good handover. I'll put it that way. Careful, really. I think I suspect Mazars have been picking things up as they've had to over the last few months, and of course they've had their own issues as well. And to your first point, which was around I think actually it's because it's not just because they're isolated, it's because also they're actually ill. Okay. Yes. So they haven't actually been at work where they've been isolating, and that, as we know, that position is improving with the vaccination programme.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Gibson.
Thank you, Chairman. It's now March, so Mr. Stewart will have held his first meeting with Mazars. Does he have confidence that this is picking up? What sort of feel did he get from that meeting with them? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a good question, actually. Can I say that it was the contracts got off to a slow start, given they were appointed in July. I think I would have expected a swifter speeding up. There's an expression which I'm thinking about now, which is something a faster takeoff with Mazars. Having said that, I find Mr. Fosco a very professional and reassuring. And not to put too fine a point on it, I think we'll do well from them in the future. Disregard that slightly slow start. I think they certainly do I've had discussions with Juan about recommendations. And I think they'll be picking up more things to improve the control environment than Crawley would have done during the same period.
Thank you, Peter. Are there any other councillors wishing to speak? I think I'd just make a couple of comments here, Peter, and not to delve into it, but something perhaps you might want to pick up and come back to. See, my understanding is that whoever this person was that didn't come, and there was nobody else who could step into their shoes, and effectively would appear there was no succession plan. In fact, you've mentioned that there was no succession plan in another part of the business as well. And do we need to have a look at that and perhaps come back to the next meeting about it? Or are we content, or is that the state, that in areas of the council's responsibility there is no succession plan, and that being so, those people aren't available, everything stops? I mean, rather than having a deep and meaningful discussion now, would you prefer come back to us at the next one and update us? Thank you.
I think, Chairman, I think it's something we can actually ask Mazars to bring to our notice, actually, during the reports. You appreciate that in some of the smaller units, you do get single points of failure because there's fewer staff around. However, where that is the case, there should be a plan. No matter how basic, there should be a plan for what they do if that person's not around, and how they it's a bit sort of effectively a business continuity plan. So I think that's something we can ask Mazars to focus on during their reports, actually. It is a key control, after all, and as you said, we've seen circumstances here where things haven't happened because people aren't around, and therefore it must be a key business risk. So I feel that we should get Mazars to report on that. That's okay.
I think that's a good idea. Would everybody support that? Thank you. Then we're going to have the recommendation about Mazars looking into continuity succession planning. But overall, I'm going to recommend that the committee recommend to receive this report. And if you would vote with your
It's all in favour, Chairman.
Thank you, Tom. And I take a lot of comfort from what Peter's been saying about, I think we're going to have an excellent relationship with Mazars. And I don't know whether anybody was able to download the horizon scanning document, which is mentioned in here. And if you do it, pick it up online, it's quite a good document. And so overall, a good report. Right. Item 6. I believe you're going to be kind enough to introduce this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, members. So the report in front of you this evening is our results report for the year ending 31st of March 2021. The purpose of the report is to present our findings from our audits so that you can take them into account for your next agenda item, which is on the financial statements for the same year. But this is a bit of an unusual report because I have to caveat everything on the basis that we have an objection to the accounts, and the work is still ongoing to address that objection. And until that process is complete, I can't finalise our judgments and conclusions in a number of areas across our audit responsibilities. So please take our report this evening with that significant caveat in mind. But we are in a position to tell you what we have done outside of that objection, what we have found. So that's what I'll concentrate on this evening. So if I could draw the members' attention to page 29 of this evening's agenda pack. That should be the areas of audit focus, starting off on misstatements due to fraud or error. So just to run through the key areas of audit focus very briefly. So for that risk, no findings to bring to your attention, which is positive. There'll be not finding management overriding the control environment. And then likewise, 2 pages on, for the risk of fraud in revenue recognition, so making sure that capital and revenue are appropriately segregated and reported as they are meant to be, and no findings in that regard either. We also had potential risk of fraud around the sales freeze and charges income grants that you received from government during the COVID pandemic. You had the opportunity to potentially manipulate this by submitting figures that were incorrect to central government, inflating what you may have lost due to the pandemic. But we haven't found any evidence that the council did that. We could tie the response to central government back to your regional budgets, for example. And we had a number of other risks, a significant risk and otherwise during the course of the audits. And on page 33 of the pack is probably the most significant one with the key finding from the audit so far this evening. And that's around the valuation of investment properties. Having selected a sample of assets, we did identify a number of differences for the matters that were set out on this page. So around short periods, voids, inclusion of purchase costs, and around assumptions on rental income. So we have discussed those with the council's valuers and with our own valuers and come to what we think is a reasonable conclusion, which has resulted in a net amendment of investment properties of £1.4 million in the accounts. We go on later on page 49 of the pack to raise a control recommendation. What we're essentially asking for is for the council's valuers to be communicating with officers within the council who are more closely aligned to the management of those assets. Hopefully, if the information flows are improved in that respect, there is a review of what the valuers are producing, then those type of issues could be picked up earlier before we get to it, ironed out and then presented more accurately in the statement of accounts before we come in and disagree. So that's the thrust of the recommendation, to try and get that improvement in communication and control before the accounts are produced. Back to the areas of risk and focus. On page 34, we talked about the valuation of property, plant and equipment. So that's more your operational assets. And there were no findings from that area. And then again, moving to page 35, we look annually at the net pension liability valuation. It's always a significant number in the accounts. It's based upon estimates. In this case, we have identified a small difference, and that really results from the fact that we have more up-to-date information when we're undertaking our audit, because we can use the audited figures from the pension fund, where the actuary's taking estimated figures and figures at a certain point in time. So I wouldn't categorise this as an issue to be concerned about. We quite often find these variances because we have that more up-to-date information, and the number is certainly not material. And then we also looked at the accounting for the remainder of the COVID grants that the council received during the year. Quite a new area that the local authorities had to deal with new income streams, and we've got no findings in that area. So as I said, the valuation of the investment properties was really the key area to bring to your attention. So those were the matters I just wanted to run through and highlight in terms of the presentation. I'd be happy to take questions on any other part of the report if members have them.
Good of you. Can I just ask one simple question? I understand all the caveats which you've made, but you said there's an item outstanding, but the worst case scenario, do you believe that would be significant to the audit sign-off? Do I need to ask you, Peter, to elaborate a little on that?
So the objection relates to a material property item within your accounts. It's material, so it will be significant. It also relates to some matters of how the council has moved through its decision-making and governance in relation to to that item. So therefore, that could impact upon my value for money responsibilities, which we haven't included in the pack here this evening. And so if there were problems we identified, that could ultimately lead to us concluding that the arrangements were not in place under the code, and therefore we might have to modify our audit opinion. So yes, those matters are pretty significant in terms of being able to complete the audit. We've got to see them through properly and fairly. Unfortunately, an objection does take time. Going back to the previous agenda item in terms of availability and what Peter was saying about availability of staff, we did get off to a slower start than we'd anticipated with the objection because we were rather stretched. We had a number of of our staff off with COVID at various points in time as well, which has impacted our delivery across the board this year. So we're working through it, but I can't really say much more than that as we work through it. And just really to emphasise that caveat is there, and hence that's why the recommendation for your next agenda item is set out in that way. That in case those items do come through, then you would either need to come back to this committee or have a delegated power of approval for the accounts.
And just remind me, when are the accounts due to be signed off?
We will sign them off when we have completed the progress. We can't set a date on that. If we set an arbitrary date and we miss it, then nothing would happen. So we've got to go through the process properly and fairly and get to the right answer rather than saying this is when it's going to happen. Now, of course, we want to do that as quickly and efficiently as we can. So we're trying to move it forward at all stages. We're not hanging around. But I just can't give you a firm date. All I can do is keep giving the officers the update of where we are and what the next stages will be and what we anticipate the timing could be at that point in time.
Brilliant, thank you. Councillors, have you any questions? Councillor Stockwell.
Thank you, Chairman. Done the report, and it looks at the moment quite good, thank you very much. Just following on from the property valuations, we've had this issue. Are you confident that within the council we have the personnel suitably experienced in dealing with looking at the valuations and make sure they're accurate and up to date and so forth? Do you have confidence that we can provide that assurance to you, as well as using your own valuers as a sort of stopgap?
I'm confident, yes. Note the hesitation. So where that comes from is when we were liaising with the council staff about the issues that we were raising, we were getting very sensible responses back. Of course, we think they were responsible because they were sensible because they were agreeing with us. But yes, we were talking with people. I'm sorry, I can't remember the officers or which department they were, but they did have a grip on exactly what we were raising, why we were raising the issues, and therefore how to sensibly move that forward. So yeah, we did get a sense of if those officers could be involved during the process as those valuations were being performed and brought together. Hopefully that should iron out some of the issues.
Councillor Crowley.
I have two questions again. Again, following on from Councillor Stockwell. You have given a indication of what you think should happen, that the council officers should be following a better communication, and that if that is successful, then it mitigates the risk of this happening again around the valuations. Do you feel that the officers and the people that you have been communicating with agree with your assessment and agree that that will mitigate the risk of this happening again? And then my second question is, I understand that we can't sign off until the piece of work has been done, but what are the consequences with the delay for however long it takes to make your conclusions?
Am I confident? Well, management have agreed the recommendation, so yes. Obviously, the recommendation therefore needs to be enacted, but yeah, I wouldn't have anticipated management would have agreed to it if they didn't believe it would also make a difference to themselves. So yes. The second part, so what are the consequences of delays? To be quite honest, none. It's, it's not great reputationally. We want to get the audits done. You'd obviously like to have a set of accounts published on your website so you can demonstrate that your finances, the financial position to the public through your statement of accounts. But there are no consequences if that does not happen. If we look at what happened this year in terms of the statutory deadline of the 30th of September, only I think it was 9% of councils were in a position to be able to publish those audited accounts. So it's not a great position to be in, and objections don't help because they do elongate the whole process. And so there is a major issue in the whole of the sector to be addressed, which is widely recognised. But individually and of consequence to yourself, no specific matters.
Content, Councillor? Gibson.
Well, 3 questions, but I've just thought of a 4th. The first 2 are about numbers. I noted the point you made about 3 asset values were misstated, but I glossed over it until you said 1.4 million, which sounds like a significant figure to me. And the next question is that if on the pension, £239,000 also sounds significant, but not material. And I just wondered if you could just give me some guidance as what would be material on a low liability of 21.25 million. You say that there's no impact of the 2021 audit, but does it impact on the follow-on audit years? Do they have to be completed before before you can move into the next year? And I just wondered where costs lay for this complaint.
Kevin.
So on page 26 of, no, not page 26, page 25 of this evening's pack, in the executive summary of our report, we set out our materiality. So materiality is effectively margin for error. How bad does a mistake have to be before it stops being true and fair in terms of the presentation of the council's accounts? So we set that on the basis of gross materiality. We applied 2% to that. So the assessment of materiality was 1.64 million. 1.4 million on the asset values is a net figure of the 3 different errors we've identified. So it's important to highlight that. So we do want those issues adjusted, or we prefer to have those issues adjusted. And I think, as I recollect, they have been adjusted through the accounts already. £239,000 on the pension liability, well, that falls below that £1.64 million of materiality. So we're happy with it. How wrong would it have to be? It would have to be greater than 1.6 million. We do, of course, caveat though, if we think something is actually fraudulent or deliberate, we will make it more of a qualitative assessment than just sticking to a number. The third question was around the knock-on to future years in terms of the follow-on audit. Yes, it's going to have an impact. If we can't conclude this year's audit, it's going to make it difficult to start next year's audit. The practical basis of closing down and rolling over a file, for example, but also it's taking up the resources that we would obviously like, especially for myself and from Manager Jack, in terms of being able to supervise and undertake the next year's audit. So we are going to have to keep revisiting that one. But again, that links back to the wider position we have in terms of resourcing, COVID, the knock-on impacts, and that 9% figure I quoted in terms of the overall delivery. But the whole of the profession for local authority audit, public sector audit is significantly backed up. So it's going to take a while to recapture that and get it back into what we would like to see as a normal cycle. And your final question was on costs for the objection. I'm afraid the costs do fall on the council.
Are you content with the answer? Can I just ask one question. The errors, were they errors of judgment or errors of accuracy?
I think to a degree there was elements of both in there. There were some aspects of judgment we disagree with, but there were also some issues where a process that we would expect to be followed in valuations wasn't. So, for example, we would expect to see void periods reflected in the valuation of investment property. There were also some mismatches against what the current rents were. So a bit of a mix of both, to be honest.
And do you believe that's now resolved and that the management... and you
It's
are
resolved
one?
for this year, and hopefully with the recommendation we have asked the council to put in place, that will mitigate it occurring again.
Thank you. Councillor Hicks.
The recommendations around valuations. I'm thinking, particularly if we're using these external valuers, whether they're the right people for the job, and whether there's sufficient departmental resource in terms of if you're looking at processes and procedures and ensuring correct processes are followed, whether that has any staffing implications or other issues that you may want to bring to our attention.
Comment on that?
I think where we get to really is that the recommendation really says, I'll paraphrase it, would finance and the estates function please talk to each other when looking at these valuations. Wilkes Head, I'll say them, Wilkes Head Eve have been providing the valuations and giving those to the finance function, who've been saying, okay, this is the figures, we'll put them into the accounts. Now, it does look as though either Wilkes Head Eve weren't given the right information, or they failed to information they had, or they weren't aware that maybe a particular rent had reduced, and therefore that would change the valuation. So, finance and the estates team, where I think there's at least 3 people who are RICS qualified, should talk to each other before actually agreeing what should go into the. That hasn't been happening. I mean, yeah, Kevin's that should mitigate it in the future. I have to say though that valuation is a bit of a very much a judgment call, and you know sentiment does play its part, and so we can't guarantee that the EY real estate team and Wilkes Head Eve and finance and estates will always agree, but let's closer than they have been in the past.
Thank you, Peter. And are you comfortable that in the future they will be a lot closer? Are there any more comments to be made? No, as far as I see that. Sorry, Councillor Hicks.
The procedure is for reporting back to this committee in terms of on the objection.
Would you like to take that, or Kevin, will you take it?
So we can provide updates as we go along to the committee meetings, but what we won't be doing is providing detail in public while that process is happening. So I can give you very broad updates if we haven't resolved it by the next committee meeting. We'll keep in touch with the officers as well as we go through each milestone and stages, and they can pass on that information to you as well. But I have to be fair. So if we're providing more information to one side, we need to provide it to both.
Yeah, no, I was thinking,
No further comments. Kevin, thank you for all your input on that. And I almost say they suggest you to have earned your fee this evening. But thank you for that. And so I'm going to recommend to the committee that this report is received, and again to confirm your intentions on the screen. Thank you.
That's unanimous again, Chairman.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. That brings us on then to item 7. I think what I'd like to do initially, though, is to, Cathy, thank you for your overview, which I think is your document, isn't it? There's- you may do another one, and it'd be nice if you just put your name at the bottom so we can know who we're thanking, but I've rather concluded with you, and I'm sure that councillors will find that a very beneficial, high-level overview, and thank you for that. Peter, are you going to introduce this, or is Cathy going to? No, it's Peter, I can see that.
I'll say a few words, Chairman, only. I mean, the substance of the report, of course, actually is in the narrative report, page 71 onwards of the financial statements. A bit of an unusual year. This is our first year this has actually happened where the audit hasn't finished, and we'll get well into the new financial year before we actually have a final opinion from the auditors, as we just heard. So unusually, we are seeking, if you're so minded, authority from the committee to allow the chair and vice chair to sign the accounts when the audit is concluded. But as it says, subject to any changes being immaterial to the accounts. So, whilst not wishing to start a big debate about what is material to the accounts, I mean, if there are outputs from the objection which would change the whole sentiment behind the audit results report, committee. But if the objection is, can I say, trifling, then I think probably the committee would, I'd like to think, would be to give you a delegation to sign those accounts off. And of course, subject to a full report meeting anyway, as Mr. Souters just said. Being so, I mean, as I said, as the audit results report says, the statement of accounts has been audited. Apart from the issues that have been discussed, it's been seen to be give a true and fair view so far. They're fit for purpose. And I'd like to think the committee can approve them subject to any changes via the debt.
Peter? Councillor Stockwell, thank you.
Quite all right, thank you. Chairman, I've got just on this part of the procedure, I've got about three little questions. The first one is on page 73 on the revenue expenditure. I just would like to have it confirmed, I assume it's the case, under landscapes and leisure, that's the cost of the payout for the leisure centres. I just want that bit confirmed. On page 102, item number 17, impairment losses. I'm just wondering, are these the losses that we have been talking about in terms of the valuation, or is there something else behind this? So I'm just trying to get a feel for what this particular item is on impairment losses and the amount involved, because we're looking at 1.565 million there. And on page 109, I'll find it. There's an item that I've written somewhere. Under debtors, I think, is it that one? Bear with me. Oh yes, we've got general allowance for bad debt. Is that a provision, or is that something? It's in credit, so I'm assuming it's a provision. I just needed that ascertained. So if perhaps Peter could answer those questions for me, please.
Your time, Peter.
Right, thank you, Chairman. It's on page 73, that figure that the actual, you can see the variation is £4.1 million. Yes, those are, that is the sum total of the cost of leisure to the authority in the last year. As you know, we both lost the income from the contract and we have been supporting it with the service that is, with substantial amounts of money, in the expectation that the contract carries on and we return to a full dividend or contract payment, really to be precise, in future years. On page 102, your second question, the impairment losses actually are mentioned below that. They do say what those two losses are. I mean, the value of, it looks like,
It is the valuation.
it is valuation, yes, by Wilkes Eddy of temporary accommodation and Oakland's offices.
So that's the effect that Kevin was talking about.
That is one part of it, I think, yes. I think the bit that Kevin was talking about was on the investment properties, which is more commonly used, let's say it was a retail centre where you've got 20 tenants, leases are getting shorter, and the valuation of that property is going down, and the judgment is, by how much is it going down? That was the main thrust of Mr. Souter's. The last one, on page 109, is that a provision? No, it's an actual, I think, isn't it? It's an actual cost. What's it shown in brackets? Because it's might need to give a written response to that, I'm afraid, Chairman.
Councillor Stockwell, would you want to have an overview of what the bad debts are?
Degree, yes, I would, please, in as much as, I don't need individual amounts, but,
No, but
yeah,
causation. more than
causation,
anything,
yes, please. And I have just one follow-up question, if I may, Chairman, with regarding to the leisure centres. The leisure centres had insurance against having to close, etc. And I wondered, were they successful in applying for that insurance premium, or not premium, payout? And are we expecting to get any of that coming our way, please?
I think the answer to that, Chairman, is no and not applicable.
To be clear then, Peter, in the right order, no, we aren't getting a divvy from insurers. And what was the non-applicable bit?
Well, yes, I mean, my understanding is, and it's what we've been using, is that they were not insured against the closure, and therefore there would be no dividend.
Really? Got that in writing from them?
Personally, I haven't. No, the contracts team, I'm assuming, would have, and they have used external specialist support to help them with the contract negotiations. So, I think across the country, Places Leisure have not received any money from their insurance towards the losses under the contract.
Just the temporary accommodation. Where was that the temporary accommodation? Losses are mainly on temporary accommodation buildings.
I don't know the individual ones, Chairman, but we do, of course, have a fairly substantial number of temporary accommodation properties. So I'm assuming it relates to the change, possibly even the change in use of those properties from individual dwellings to temporary accommodation now. A different...
And so would that mean that there was a difference of opinion as to what Oakland's was worth of 751,000.
Yes, Chairman, that's correct.
Right, okay, thank you. Councillor Gibson.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll declare an interest arising from my membership of West Sussex County Council and ask a question regarding the relationship between the District Council and the County Council on the collection fund. Mr. Stewart will recognise that in the past we've discussed the additional income in year from completions in year and whether it should be passed downwards to parish councils. And he's assured me that it shouldn't be. It should be retained at district level. But I noted in the county council budget that there was an element, I can't remember whether 98% of collection was in this set of accounts or whether it was in the West Sussex accounts. I think it was in the West Sussex accounts. And they are carrying a figure in that as to what they expect to be paid in future years from districts. So I wondered whether that was where that was represented in these accounts, or indeed if that was a correct assessment of the situation.
As I understand the question, Chairman, and Chairman, if I got this wrong, because there was a mention of a parish council in there, and I'm not sure that actually was relevant in the end.
I'm sure Councillor Gibson will repeat the question slowly for us all, if necessary.
Do we carry forward, I think the question was, do we carry forward surpluses in the collection fund for the next year? I think, and the answer was yes. It helps to reduce the council tax in any one year. If you have a surplus in the previous year, you bring it forward into the next year and effectively reduce your council tax increase.
Would you like to come back, Councillor Gibson?
Just like to come back on that because of the relationship with the element that was in the West Sussex County budget. So maybe it's something we should take offline because I didn't understand it. So, and I've forgotten to bring the budget with me today. I was going to bring it. But there's a distinct line in that budget that is expecting an income relating to under collection in current years.
I mean, if there is money outstanding, which of course there will always be money outstanding at the end of any financial year. In fact, every year you roll it forward, and there's money probably outstanding for the last 5 years. Actually, the county can rely on receiving monies from previous years in the next year. So that would be, yes, that would be quite right. And the accounts have been through audit. So I'd assume that the figures in there you can rely on, both with ours and and the counties.
Councillor Gibson, are you content? Councillor Hicks.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a question for Kevin, really, in terms of value for money and the investment properties. And I find it hard to gauge whether we, in terms of our level of income and whether that is good or bad. But I don't know in terms of what assessment of your value for money judgment have you looked at in relation to investment properties?
Value for money is incredibly subjective, and that's why our assessment under the Code of Audit Practice is about arrangements. You can have, we can assess arrangements, are they there or not? To assess whether something is or is not value for money is too difficult, basically. So, for example, around investment properties, if you were making an investment, we would look at, have you had the right decisions? Have you had the right people involved? Have you taken the right advice? Does the business case stack up? That would be the arrangements we would be looking for. Whether something then actually turns out to be value for money or not, we can't ever control. COVID happens, and your business case gets turned upside down. So we can only look at the arrangements you've got in place, and that's the extent of what we do. So we're not really looking at specifics in terms of what that is doing at that point in time. That really falls into our accounts work to make sure you've got the right value based upon the right information for it.
it's hard given the amount of time we spend on treasury management, I think there's the potential for a gap in terms of how we monitor investment properties. And that as a member.
And Peter, I'm sure will take that on.
What I'd say to members really is, that, of course, if members, I'm sure members have read the Constitution, if members feel strongly about any particular subject, including investment properties, 5 members can get together and ask for a report for scrutiny. We're quite happy to provide that if you think there's a demand for such an item. But, you know, we're always open to having discussions about the investment properties or any item actually within the accounts. Obviously, very hard to do it on this evening, but on the evening. But quite happy to, if you like, open the books and show you what's going on with any of our properties.
I think as a generality, you're content, aren't you, Councillor Hicks, that it would be a...
Oh, that's all I'm saying, really, in terms of, but it's perhaps something to keep under review.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Crowley.
Thank you. Going back to the leisure centres, now that's a considerable amount of money, and you know, I'm acutely aware that whilst our leisure centres are fantastic, not everybody who is paying for them is getting the benefit of using them. So we can't do anything about what has already happened, and we've discussed the fact that there wasn't a contingency in their insurance to cover for when they were closed. But we're living in a new world. Is there anything we can do to make sure that that's covered going forward? So if there was another pandemic or for any other reason we had to close them, that would be covered by the insurance and wouldn't be, our taxpayers wouldn't be footing the bill.
I imagine it was going to be very hard to get insurance in today's market for such an eventuality. I suppose I'd also say, I suppose, that question is going beyond the realms of the accounts and the financial statements, but certainly something that could be brought up with the appropriate people. There's little we can do right now to future-proof ourselves against any more losses. If another variant comes along, I think there'll be some very tough decisions to take about how you want to keep the centres open.
Thank you for that, Peter. Just as a comment, I think it's interesting that it would appear that the principles in this have not carried effectively business interruption. And I think probably offline it would be quite nice, Peter, if we were just to understand how we all stood going forward, because it could be a very significant risk to this council, and I think probably we ought to understand that, and if necessary, put it in the risk register so that everybody understands formally what the exposures are. And thank you. There are no other questions, so I am going to go to the recommendations, but on this occasion I'm just going to read these out because B, I think, is quite important. The recommendations are that the committee is recommended to approve the financial statements for the year ending 31st March 2021, and B, authorise the chair and vice chair of the committee to sign the accounts when the audit has been concluded, subject to any changes being immaterial to the accounts. And on that basis, it's recommended to you, and perhaps you'd be kind enough to vote. Thank you. Have I not voted? Thank you. I was wondering if it might be.
On the screen.
It is, because I did. Yeah.
And that's unanimous again, Chairman.
Thank you very much. That takes us on to item 8. And Peter, are you going to introduce this?
Thank you. What I would say about the capital strategy is that it sets out, as you can see, of all the factors that get taken into account when putting together a corporate plan, a corporate capital programme. It sets out our approach to borrowing. It sets out the approach to paying the money back. There may be a need to revise it in year, depending on what happens with the couple of consultations that are going on right now. But for this year, I've made no changes to last year's report, so there's no change in strategy for this year compared to last year. Our capital programme is actually relatively modest. We're not obviously not a unitary or a county council that's spending money all the time on big capital projects. So there's a limited range of projects to consider anyway. In terms of process, I should say that by exception, Council tomorrow will agree the capital strategy unless members have any tweaks they want to make to the strategy, because the strategy before you tonight is the same as in the corporate plan before you tomorrow night. So if you did have any changes to make tomorrow, you could rehearse them here and then make an amendment tomorrow. So given that it's virtually the same as last year's strategy, I think you could, it will be approved tomorrow unless you've got any other suggestions for improving it.
Thank you, Peter. Did you want to make any comment on 5.3, the background papers, the very last paragraph?
Did actually, Chairman, you're quite right, because actually this report is so similar to last year's report that it actually includes the same background papers as in last year. So unfortunately the dates were not changed, and this is all my fault, I'm afraid. And the scrutiny committee was, I think, the 14th of 2022, but it's the same meeting each year.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. Are there any councillors who wish to speak? Councillor Stockwell, thank you.
Just trying to get a little understanding, please, Peter. On page 161, under the proposed projects for 22-23, item small v, housing. Affordable housing schemes are funded wholly or mainly from S106 contributions. Is that normal? I looked at that, I thought, that looks a bit strange to me. Maybe showing my ignorance here, but how affordable housing, when we have a development going on, obviously we request that at least 30% of the houses built by the developers are affordable in some form or fashion. So how does that work with the 106 contributions, please?
My understanding, Chairman, is that not all schemes actually do provide you affordable housing. What they often will do is provide them money for affordable housing instead, so it becomes affordable housing 106, which then enables us then to spend that 106 on creating housing elsewhere, affordable housing elsewhere. It is normal. It is a fact that that's what happens. I think there's a scheme happening right now actually in East Grinstead, the Blackwell Farm, where we're using 106, affordable housing 106 to enable people to, it's a Guinness Trust, to mitigate to remediate the site prior to its development.
Councillor Stockwell, you'd like to come back?
We have a fund of 106 money specifically for affordable housing, and so that we can be confident that that specific fund is used for that purpose and not used in other areas. Because where a developer is not providing the affordable housing, as would be requested within the planning application, it's rather like they've offloaded by paying money rather than think they can build better houses and get more money for them. So the district misses out on those affordable houses. So it's their way of offsetting, I guess, what they're doing. But are those monies held separately and specifically for affordable housing? And so if I ask the question, could you show me the numbers for this? You could do that. Thank you.
Well, I can do exactly that, Chairman. I can do exactly that because I have in my hand a piece of paper which shows we have an affordable housing balance of £1.75 million. And without wishing to comment on some of the comments you've made, we do struggle sometimes to get that affordable housing money away. Hence, we'd like to spend that 1.75 million on affordable housing, but sometimes the schemes just don't come forward.
You content? Councillor, thank you. Councillor Hicks.
Thank you, Chairman. It was just whether sustainability should be a factor in terms of our strategy, and if it should be, whether we should look at how we assess capital projects in light of sustainability issues, and to ensure that we're not just getting value for money, but we're getting value that in terms of the sustainability issues. And perhaps if we could just have some feedback on that. But just going back to Councillor Stockwell's, I'm just interested in terms of the comment that you had issues perhaps always working out getting bids for social housing, and in terms of how that process works in terms of it involving, is it for housing associations to come forward with specific sites, or how we communicate that process? Thank you.
Something that you're able to answer, or is it planning?
It is I don't really work in that sort of field, no, so that I couldn't really comment on that aspect of the question. The first bit, though, is of interest because, as you know, there's a sustainable economic strategy coming forward to the council, and I think that includes some measures, or possibilities at least, around sustainability issues in the capital programme. And I think there will be a measure to include in the justification statements that councillors see the sustainability level of those capital projects. So I think work is happening on that. It's not directly, as you say, it's not directly referenced within this, but I think it will be in the future.
You wish to come back?
No, I suppose in the future.
You're content. Tom Clark wishes to speak.
It was only to say that in the past, some parish councils have come forward with housing schemes, particularly the smaller ones with exemption sites. So that's always a possibility given the funding we've got here.
I see nobody else wishes to speak. That being so, I'm going to go to the recommendations. 2.1, the committee is recommended to forward the draft strategy to approved by council at the next appropriate meeting, and perhaps we can all vote. Thank you.
Unanimous again, Chairman.
Thank you very much, councillors. Thank you. Right, we are on to agenda item 9. Peter, I think you're introducing this too, aren't you?
I am, Chairman, briefly, in the sense that usually Pamela Coppelman from Ada Worthing would come along to introduce this. She's the expert in this area. However, the report does bear my name, so I will say a few words, which are to say, really, that the report actually, again, I'm afraid, it's a bit like last year's report, in the sense that, not a great, we don't want any great veers and change in direction in Treasury management, I don't think. So we have kept the, apart from, as you see in paragraph, in summary, paragraph 2.1, agreed to change our counterparty investment limits earlier in the year, so we're just now adding those in properly. Other than that, there is actually no difference between this strategy and previous year's strategy, which has, I think, served us quite well during the pandemic. Thank you.
Are there any questions you'd like to pose to Councillor Stockwell?
I'm sorry, Chairman. I've usually got one somewhere. And as it's Peter Stewart Day today, he's the star of the show, I think, at the moment. I picked up on page 173, under external borrowing and the Treasury investments. Under banks, it's got something called Debt Management Office. I thought, what the devil's that? Perhaps you could explain it to me. There's 5 million investment there. So I wondered, who are Debt Management Office, or what is it?
Management Office are the government. Yes, so we have, members will appreciate, we have received many millions of pounds of grant funding. And prior to that going out to the recipients, we've struggled actually to put it away at the banks. And so, oddly enough, sometimes we have had to lend it back to the government. And they've paid us a very modest interest rate on that. But such has been the glut of money in the market that it's been a necessity to actually take the money in the left hand and hand it back with the right.
I see no other questions on this report. I'm not going to read out the recommendations because they're quite lengthy, but nevertheless, I am recommending to you that you agree Roman 1, 2, 3 and 4. So if you'd be kind enough to vote. Thank you.
And once again, unanimous, Chairman.
Thank you, councillors. Right, that brings us on to item 10. Peter, it's for you to introduce this as well.
It is, Chairman. We're back on more familiar territory here, I think, in the sense that we have been here before, but not last year, as the report says, back in 2015. Now, I think the report does mention, there's one local authority, not so far away in here, that has decided to go out to procure its own external auditor individually, unilaterally, as the report mentions. I think there's some good reasons why we wouldn't want to do that. And I posit that they are in the report. One is actually it's an awful lot of work to go out there that can do this kind of local authority work. This is not the province of a high street accountant or auditor. And I think it's a bit of a risky business, to be honest, to go out individually when you could actually basically use a framework. Now, I know members will probably think, well, we used a framework last time, and it hasn't been a resounding success, and that's no disrespect to EY at all, because it hasn't been a resounding success across the board. In one sense, the cost of the audit has come down tremendously since the Audit Commission was demised. I think we were paying some £100,000, £110,000 a year, although we'd probably say they got a lot more extras with their bill than you get right now. In a sector who just want the audit done, it has proved to be good value as well. So there's kind of pluses and minuses, but on balance, I think, Chairman, I personally would say the council would do well to go with PSAA. I think Kevin hopefully would agree with me that the PSAA have certainly sharpened up their act. Concerned it cannot just be about price in the future. I think going down the price side may lead to a cheap audit, but not a good audit. They really need to take into account quality as well, and I think they're doing that this time round. So I'm pretty confident we'll get a good outcome next time, and I'd like to think it might be any of the firms who are qualified to do the work, but I would caution against going solo and going for an individual unilateral audit.
Thank you, Peter. Does anybody would like to comment? Councillor Stockwell.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, from memory, we did this before, and I understand that one of the big issues for auditors has been the revs and bends, the problems that, I suppose, the changes to the legislation and how they're accounted for, I guess. So can we take comfort from the fact that the PSAA will have on their books those auditors who are comfortable and confident in dealing with those really difficult areas? That's my question.
Thank you. Peter.
Well, not an easy question to answer. I think we may have a comment here, but let us say that over the last few years, auditing has not been the most glamorous of professions, and the audit firms themselves have come under tremendous scrutiny when things have gone wrong, and that hasn't really led to a great attraction of new talents coming into the industry. And I've heard Watson talk on this subject about they can resource, for example, they're one of the big firms, they can resource the London audits and they can get graduates to work in the London audits. You know, the industry does require a certain level of people coming through it, but just like local government, there's a demographic there where the 55s to 65s are gradually leaving, and the young graduates, aside from working in London, they're finding it difficult to attract people, new talent into the business. So London's fine, trying to get an audit done, get audit graduates to work in Devon, not so easy. So a bit of a shake-up coming, I think, probably for the industry. Let's hope it does actually. It should mean that salaries and compensation rises, and the cycle starts again, where audit becomes somewhere where people are feeds through into the whole sector, and we pay a bit more. Let's face it, we need to pay a bit more for our audit if we want to see a good audit done, which is sustainable over the longer term.
I certainly think we want to see a quality audit. But Kevin, would you like to comment at all?
Very glad to hear that you would like to see a quality audit, and we very much seek to provide that. And yes, the PSAA have changed how they're procuring since the last time to try and take on board a number of factors. But the bar is quite high. It is a very specialist area. I mean, you've just looked through your statement of accounts. I can't remember how many pages that was. Infinitely more complex than looking through a standard business set of accounts. So it does require training, investment, and then we need to try and keep those people once we've trained and invested in them. And Peter's comments on the profession are really accurate. It's been a challenging period recently, and COVID hasn't made that any easier. We've tried to do audits virtually, not being able to do them in a traditional way. If members are interested, the Department of, we'll get this one wrong, Levelling Up Housing Communities, did I get that right? They published a paper back in December of last year, I think around the 16th of December, looking at some of the wider issues, not just the auditing, not just the SAA's role, but some of the other challenges that are going on in the sector. I would recommend that as a good read, actually, to look at the sort of issues that are being faced at the moment and how the various people are coming together to try and attack the underlying issues, as well as just sorting out the procurement for the next round of the SAA procurements.
Peter, I think we owe them a letter, don't we, that we need to sign off?
We do, Chairman. I should have mentioned, actually, in terms of process, I think Mr. Clark will confirm that this will come forward as urgent business tomorrow, because it has to be the council has to decide rather on your recommendation. So the letter at page 201 has to go back to them by the 11th of March. Come forward as urgent item tomorrow night for council approval.
Tom, you're going to comment?
Just to confirm, the chairman of council has been put on notice, so I'll have advise her of this tomorrow morning, and I'm sure she'll then agree to take it as an urgent item.
So, Kevin, are we going to see starting auditors, younger, coming straight into the business at £150,000 a year, is like the Magic Circle lawyers? Don't have to comment on that. Right, councillors, on that basis, fripperies aside, recommendation is there in item 2, and if you're content to agree with that, I would ask you to vote accordingly.
Once again, unanimous, Chairman.
Thank you. Brings me to item 11, and I need to state to you that we're to consider whether to exclude the press and the public from the meeting during the consideration of the following items in accordance with section 100A of the Local Government Act 1972 on the grounds that it involves the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in paragraph 3 and 7 of part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Act. And I'm merely asking for you to concur by a show of hands. Thank you. That's carried. You need to stay. You're invited to stay, Kevin. Subject to any offline discussions that I have, the committee is recommended to note the report and the actions taken. Please acknowledge on your machines. Thank you.
Unanimous again, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just referring to my agenda, because we've got one more item to go.
We are on the from 13, so just questions pursuant to council procedure.
Right, we do, let me just read that out. Thank you, I lost the plot. Councillors, item 13 is questions pursuant to the council procedure rule 10.2, due notice of which has been given. There is no comment on that. Thank you. That being so, it's 7 o'clock. I'm going to close the meeting, and thank you very much for your diligence and for, I think, a very productive meeting on behalf of everybody. And thank you.